Have you ever felt like someone was half in, half out, like you were just one of many options? Or maybe you've been with someone who suddenly shifts their behavior when they realize you're not just anyone, you're the one. When it comes to avoidant attachment styles, their actions speak volumes. And today we're unpacking exactly how their behavior changes depending on how they see you. When you're just an option to someone with an avoidant attachment style, everything they do is filtered through one simple lens: convenience. They'll engage with you when it fits into their schedule, when it doesn't ask too much of them emotionally, and when they're in the mood. You'll notice it in the small things first. The way they take hours or even days to respond to your message. The way they flake on plans last minute, offering vague reasons that never quite add up. The way they keep you at arm's length, not just physically, but emotionally. You might find yourself constantly guessing where you stand because they never give enough of themselves for you to feel secure. They're charming when they're around, often even affectionate in spurts, but it's like they have this internal switch that flips off the moment they feel things are becoming too real. If you try to get closer, they pull away. If you step back, they suddenly return, not because they miss you deeply, but because they want to re-establish that thread of connection without committing to anything deeper. It's their way of keeping control of their space, their emotions, their vulnerability. To them, you represent a possible connection, not a necessary one. You're someone they can talk to when they're lonely or bored, someone who fills a gap in their life without threatening to unravel their emotional defenses. It doesn't mean they don't like you, but liking someone isn't the same as valuing them. And when an avoidant sees you as just one of many options, there's no urgency. There's no real investment. They don't ask themselves what you're feeling or whether you're okay when you've gone silent. They assume you'll be there if and when they feel like reaching out. They don't make sacrifices to see you or show up consistently because they haven't decided you're worth adjusting their life for. You're not central, you're peripheral, and you'll feel that whether you admit it to yourself or not. Conversations stay surface level. Plans are often vague or open-ended. They don't include you in their long-term vision because they haven't made space for anyone in that vision. They don't ask the deeper questions that help build emotional intimacy, and they rarely offer anything vulnerable about themselves unless it's in a brief, controlled way that they can quickly retreat from. And here's where it gets tricky. Their behavior often creates just enough connection to keep you hanging on. You might tell yourself it's just bad timing, that they've been hurt before, that they're slow to open up. And while all of that might be true, what's more important is how they're choosing to engage with you right now. Because when someone sees you as just an option, they don't feel the need to show up with depth. They'll give you breadcrumbs of attention, affection, maybe even passion, but rarely consistency. If you try to bring up your needs or express frustration about the dynamic, they'll often deflect, get defensive, or act confused, like you're reading too much into things. Because in their mind, they haven't made any promises. They've been keeping things light. And that lightness gives them an out. It lets them feel they're not doing anything wrong, even though what they're doing is keeping you emotionally on the hook without offering any real clarity or commitment. And the hardest part is that they may still be warm, still say nice things, still act like they care, but none of it is backed by effort. None of it disrupts their world or forces them to grow. When you're just an option to someone avoidant, the energy is always passive. They react, but they don't initiate. They enjoy your presence, but they don't prioritize it. They like the idea of you, but they haven't taken the time to truly see you, because to them, you're not a decision. You're a convenience, and convenience never asks for sacrifice, for depth, or for change. It simply waits on the shelf, ready when they are, quiet when they're not. That's what it feels like to be an option to someone who guards their emotions with walls instead of boundaries. The connection always hovers at arm's length, never quite close enough to feel safe, never quite distant enough to let go. When someone with an avoidant attachment style begins to see you as more than just another person in their life, as someone who genuinely matters, someone who feels different, they don't suddenly become emotionally available, but something subtle and important starts to shift. They begin to fight through their fear. Avoidants are wired to protect themselves from intimacy, not because they don't crave it deep down, but because closeness has often felt unsafe to them in the past. They've built emotional armor not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, out of a belief that vulnerability equals pain, and that letting someone in means giving away control. So when someone like that meets a person who stirs something real, the instinct isn't immediately to run toward the connection. It's to freeze, to question, to resist. But here's the thing. When you're the one, they feel it. They may not say it out loud. In fact, they probably won't. But their behavior starts to tell a story they're not even aware they're writing. You'll see them hesitate, not out of disinterest, but because they're battling with the part of themselves that's terrified of being seen. They don't just disappear like they would with someone they don't see a future with. Instead, they pause. They might become inconsistent for a moment or pull away slightly, not because they don't care, but because they're assessing the risk of letting their guard down. This is where it gets complicated. Being the one doesn't mean they become emotionally fluent overnight. What it means is that you activate something in them they can't ignore. And even if they want to return to their patterns of distance and detachment, they find it harder to do so. They start showing up in small, messy, imperfect ways. They make time when they wouldn't have before. They listen more closely. They circle back after pulling away. They might still seem guarded, but underneath that surface there's a quiet effort happening, an internal battle where you're not just a fleeting connection, you're now someone they fear losing. And that fear is a signal. Not a manipulative one, but a vulnerable one. It's the part of them that's realizing they might have to do the thing they've avoided for so long. Take emotional responsibility. See, avoidants don't fight for people they don't deeply care about. If they can leave and feel nothing, they will. But when they meet someone who triggers real emotion, the stakes rise. Now they're no longer just managing their own space, they're managing a connection that matters. And with that comes tension. You might feel the push and pull. You'll notice moments where they open up, only to withdraw again. You'll see vulnerability followed by retreat. But it's no longer about avoidance for comfort, it's about survival, emotional survival. Because now they've tasted something real. And while they may not know how to hold it yet, they're trying. They don't always do it gracefully. Sometimes it'll come out sideways. They might test you, pull away to see if you'll follow, or even create conflict to feel a sense of control. But beneath that chaos is an uncomfortable truth. They're not trying to escape you. They're trying to protect themselves from what you make them feel. You make them feel exposed. You make them feel unsure. You make them feel something they can't just shrug off. And when you're the one, they may not say those words, but their actions start revealing it in ways they never intended. The avoidance doesn't vanish. The fear doesn't dissolve, but they start to lean in, inch by inch, even while the fear is still present. They cancel fewer plans. They reach out without a clear reason. They become more curious about your inner world. They try to make room, even if they don't always know how. And when they mess up, they don't just disappear like they might with someone they weren't invested in. They come back. Maybe not with flowers and a speech, but with a phone call, a check-in, a quiet effort to repair something they would have let crumble in the past. It's not a grand gesture that tells you they see you as the one. It's the way they start to wrestle with themselves in your presence. The way they begin to challenge their own patterns, not perfectly, not all at once, but with a kind of urgency they've never felt before. Because this time, the connection matters in a way they can't fully explain, and they can't fully avoid either. When someone with an avoidant attachment style sees you as just an option, they maintain emotional distance almost effortlessly. It's second nature to them. They stay in control by keeping things light, steering conversations away from vulnerability, avoiding deep talks about feelings, and limiting emotional exposure. You might spend time with them, share laughs, even build some physical closeness, but there's a ceiling on the emotional intimacy, an invisible barrier you keep bumping up against every time you try to connect more deeply. They don't share too much about themselves. They don't ask the kind of questions that would open the door to your emotional world. Everything feels surface level because that's where they feel safe. They operate like they've got a cap on how much of themselves they're willing to invest. And if you ever try to lean in more than they're comfortable with, you'll feel them emotionally withdraw. They might become vague, dismissive, or even cold. It's not personal, it's protective. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to manage their own emotional world by keeping it unburdened, detached, and controlled. But when that same avoidant meets someone they see as the one, the dynamic doesn't stay so neatly detached. It starts to fracture because their feelings begin to challenge the rules they've always lived by. And suddenly the very emotional distance they once used as a shield becomes a source of inner conflict. They still want to protect themselves, still want to stay in control, but now there's a new fear creeping in, the fear of losing something meaningful. This person in front of them is different, and that difference starts to cause emotional dissonance. You'll notice it in their behavior. They don't shut down as quickly. They seem a little more present, a little more affected by what you say and do. When you pull away, they feel it more. When you're upset, they notice. They might not have the tools to respond perfectly, but there's a weight to your emotional state that wasn't there with others. It matters to them, and that awareness shifts everything. Emotional distance is no longer just a strategy, it becomes a struggle. They try to stay aloof, but they can't quite detach the way they used to. You become the exception to the pattern they've repeated so many times. And because that pattern has been a source of emotional safety for them, this shift doesn't come without tension. They start to question themselves. They might act out in confusing ways, close in one moment, distant the next, not because they don't care, but because they're at war with their own defenses. They're not used to wanting connection and fearing it at the same time. When they meet someone who feels like the one, that emotional tug-of-war begins. Their usual calmness starts to give way to anxiety. They may become more reactive, more insecure, more self-protective, but all of it is fueled by emotional investment. They begin to realize that emotional distance, once a source of safety, is now creating risk. If they stay distant, they might lose this person. If they get too close, they might lose their sense of emotional control. And for someone avoidant, that's a terrifying trade-off. So what happens is this in-between state where they're not fully in but can't walk away either. You'll see glimpses of vulnerability they quickly retract. You'll hear them open up, only to backtrack the next day. It's like watching someone who's afraid of the water, dipping a toe in, then panicking and pulling back, not because they don't want to swim, but because they've never learned how without sinking. And the emotional conflict becomes the very sign that you're not just another option. They didn't wrestle with their feelings for others. They didn't analyze every interaction. They didn't feel this pull toward closeness that scared them as much as it drew them in. But with you, there's this internal dialogue they can't silence. They want to trust but don't know how. They want to open up but feel exposed. They want to hold on but fear being held accountable for someone else's heart. Emotional distance used to be effortless. Now it feels heavy. Now it feels like something they have to consciously choose. And in doing so, they start to realize how much it costs them. That internal shift doesn't always translate to external clarity. You might still get mixed signals. You might still feel confused. But underneath it all is an avoidant who's starting to care in ways they can't easily suppress. And that emotional conflict is the clearest indication that you've stopped being an option and become something that actually threatens the walls they've spent a lifetime building. When an avoidant sees you as just another option, their behavior tends to follow a very predictable rhythm. They give you just enough to keep your interest, but never enough to create real momentum. This is the classic breadcrumbing pattern. They drop small pieces of attention, affection, or interest your way, often sporadically, to ensure you stay emotionally tethered without them having to offer genuine consistency or depth. One day they'll send a message that seems sweet or thoughtful, and the next they'll disappear for days without explanation. You might go out on a date that feels fun and intimate, only to have them act distant or indifferent afterward. It's this strange in and out behavior that keeps you guessing, always hoping that the next breadcrumb might lead to something more solid, more secure. But the truth is, when someone sees you as just an option, they're not invested in building anything long-term with you. They're managing your presence, not nurturing it. They're giving the bare minimum to maintain access, not offering real emotional presence. You find yourself constantly interpreting their mixed signals, trying to read into texts, wondering what you did wrong when they go quiet, even though nothing significant happened. The reason breadcrumbing works is because it plays on your hope. Each small gesture makes you think you're getting closer, when in reality, you're stuck in the same emotional holding pattern, unable to grow because they're not giving you anything stable to build on. Now contrast that with how avoidants act when they start to see someone as the one. The shift is subtle at first, but over time, the pattern begins to break. Instead of breadcrumbing, they begin to seek consistency, not always in a perfect romantic way, but in a very real human way. They start to show up more regularly. They may still be guarded, still hesitant, but they're no longer feeding you scraps just to keep you around. Their effort becomes less about maintaining control and more about staying connected. They might initiate contact more often. They might check in with you in ways that feel meaningful rather than strategic. They start remembering things you said, following up on details that matter to you, making time instead of excuses. It's not necessarily grand gestures, it's the steady presence that begins to replace the emotional scarcity you might have experienced with them in the past. Even when they pull away, which they still might do out of instinct, they don't stay away as long. They return, not with breadcrumbs, but with accountability. They acknowledge the space, explain their hesitation, or simply show up differently than before. It's that willingness to try again that begins to replace the manipulation of breadcrumbing. It means they're not just reaching out to soothe their own guilt or boredom. They're reaching out because your presence has started to matter in a way that challenges their usual emotional habits. They become aware, even if not always verbally, that they can't treat you like they've treated others. And with that awareness comes discomfort. They realize that the emotional games they once played to maintain distance now threaten the connection they actually want to keep. So they begin to adjust. It might look clumsy, it might be slow, but it's intentional. They're not leading you on anymore. They're trying to lead themselves out of old patterns. When they breadcrumb options, it's to maintain control without investment. But when they see you as the one, they start choosing consistency, not because it's easy, but because losing you feels heavier than the fear they've lived with. They're not giving you crumbs, they're trying to give you what they can, even if it's not perfect. And what's more important is that they notice the difference in themselves. They may not say it, but they feel it. You'll notice they stop running to distraction when things get hard. They don't default to silence after conflict. They want resolution. They want repair. You might still feel unsure at times because their avoidant tendencies don't disappear overnight, but there's a shift in the pattern, a noticeable break in the loop of withdrawal and minimal effort. Instead of creating distance when things get emotional, they begin slowly to close the gap. You won't feel like you're chasing them anymore. You'll feel like they're walking toward you, not with perfect clarity, but with enough intention to show you that this is no longer a game of emotional crumbs. It's a slow, conscious movement towards something that matters more than control or safety. It's about keeping a connection they're finally realizing they don't want to lose. When you're just an option to someone with an avoidant attachment style, there's this subtle but constant feeling that you're replaceable. You can sense it in the way they treat your time, in the way they respond to your needs, in the way they talk about the future, or don't. You're never quite sure where you stand because they never give you enough clarity to feel safe. One moment they're warm and charming, and the next they're distant and distracted, and you're left trying to figure out what changed. But deep down, what you feel more than anything is that if you walked away, they wouldn't fight for you. Maybe they'd notice, maybe they'd even send a message eventually, but it wouldn't come from a place of fear of losing you. It would come from a place of ego, of wanting to maintain a sense of control or access. And that's what being an option feels like. It's not necessarily cruel, it's not always disrespectful, it's just emotionally indifferent. Your absence wouldn't disrupt their world. Your presence doesn't shift anything meaningful in them. It's not that you're not worthy, it's that they haven't decided to value you. And with an avoidant, that decision is everything. Because when they do see someone as the one, the entire energy changes. It doesn't mean they suddenly become emotionally open or know how to navigate closeness with ease. In fact, when they care more, they often become more conflicted. But the difference lies in the way they respond to the idea of losing you. Now, the fear of closeness they've carried for so long is met with another fear, losing something they actually want. And that creates a new kind of emotional urgency. When you're the one, they can't brush you off in the same way. They might still try to act indifferent, still pretend they're unaffected, but it's not convincing anymore, not even to themselves. Because now your silence feels louder, your absence feels heavier. They're not used to caring that much. They're not used to being emotionally disrupted. So they begin to act in ways that show their fear, not just of being close, but of losing the rare person who made them feel something deeper. You'll notice this fear doesn't always come out in graceful or romantic ways. Sometimes it looks like overthinking. Sometimes it's jealousy. Sometimes it's confusion or hesitation. But it's all coming from the same place. They've stopped seeing you as someone who can be easily replaced. You represent risk. Not just the risk of vulnerability, but the risk of regret. And regret is a powerful motivator, especially for someone who's lived most of their emotional life trying to avoid it. They start noticing the little things more. They remember details. They're not as quick to let conflict linger. They might still struggle with consistency, but there's a visible effort to show up, to repair, to be present in ways they weren't with people who didn't matter as much. They start worrying about what their actions mean to you. They consider your perspective, even if they don't always respond perfectly. And they begin to realize that this connection could slip away if they keep treating it the way they treated everyone else. That awareness creates a tension in them, but also a drive. You'll see it in the way they start to do the small things that matter, the way they circle back after space, the way they try to make amends, the way they start including you in parts of their life that were once private. They might still wrestle with the fear of being vulnerable, but now they're also wrestling with the fear of losing something real. And that fear is what starts to break the old patterns. They don't want to risk you walking away and never looking back. They don't want to feel the weight of what they let go. That's how you know you're not an option anymore. Because now you represent something rare. Now you've become a mirror that reflects not just what they could have, but what they could lose. And even the most emotionally guarded person starts to respond differently when the cost of their usual defenses starts to feel too high. They begin to realize that the way they protected themselves before won't work here. Not if they want to keep someone like you. You won't feel like a placeholder. You'll feel like a presence they're afraid to mishandle, not because they've mastered intimacy, but because for the first time, the risk of losing someone feels more terrifying than the risk of letting someone in.